All right, welcome back to The Deep Dive. Today we're diving into a pretty dense topic, but trust me, it's going to be worth it.
Hmm. I'm intrigued. You've piqued my curiosity.
You know how we always talk about those aha moments where a really complex idea suddenly makes sense?
Yeah, those light bulb moments, I love those.
Exactly. Well, today's deep dive is all about finding those aha moments as we explore the history of analytic philosophy in Latin America.
Latin America, interesting. Not the first place that comes to mind when I think about analytic philosophy.
Right, but that's what makes it so fascinating. And you know me, I always bring the goods. This time, it's a comprehensive entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. So we're going deep, deep, deep into how this particular way of doing philosophy took root and blossomed in a completely different cultural context.
Okay, so what's the mission here? Are we just laying out a timeline of events, or is there something more we're trying to uncover?
It's so much more than a timeline. We're using this specific case study to understand what it really means to do philosophy, like how do traditions evolve, how do thinkers shape those traditions, and what can we learn from those processes?
I like it. It's like a meta-analysis of philosophical development using Latin America as our lens.
You got it. But before we jump into the specifics, let's level set. What exactly are we talking about when we say analytic philosophy?
Well, think of it less as a single rigid school of thought and more like a family of approaches that share some core
A
characteristics.
family with, like, some strong family resemblances.
Haha, precisely. So, one key trait is a generally positive attitude towards scientific knowledge. Analytic philosophers tend to see science as a valuable source of information and insights that can inform philosophical inquiry.
So not shying away from science, but actually embracing it.
Right. And in contrast to some other traditions, there's a more cautious approach to grand, sweeping metaphysical theories.
So not building elaborate castles in the sky, but more grounded in, well, analysis.
Exactly. The focus is often on clarifying concepts, analyzing language, and making sure our ideas are as clear and well-defined as possible.
Ah, so it's about getting a firm grasp on the building blocks of our understanding rather than trying to create some ultimate system of reality.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Another crucial aspect is the close relationship between language and philosophy.
I was just going to ask about that. It seems like language plays a pretty central role in this whole analytic approach.
It absolutely does. The idea is that many philosophical problems are, at their core, problems about language.
Interesting. So by carefully examining the language we use, we can often make significant progress in solving philosophical puzzles.
That's the core idea. And of course,
Mhm.
there's a strong emphasis on providing rigorous arguments and striving for clarity in those arguments.
Clarity above all else.
Well, clarity is certainly highly valued. Think about figures like Frege, Moore, Russell, the early Wittgenstein. These are some of the big names associated with the development of this tradition.
Right, the heavyweights of analytic philosophy.
Hmm.
But it's not just about individuals, is it? There's also a community aspect to this.
Absolutely. The analytic tradition thrives on dialogue, debate, and the exchange of ideas. It develops through communities of scholars, networks of mentors and students, and colleagues pushing each other's thinking forward.
A shared project, even if there are disagreements along the way.
Exactly. Now, here's where things get especially interesting for our deep dive. The source points out two additional characteristics that were really key to how analytic philosophy unfolded in Latin America. And these traits speak directly to our focus on acting as philosophers.
Okay, lay it on me. What were these special ingredients?
First, there's a strong focus on metaphilosophy.
Metaphilosophy, so philosophy about philosophy itself.
Precisely. Because analytic philosophy was arriving in a context where other philosophical traditions were already well established, there's a natural tendency to reflect on what this new approach was all about.
It makes sense, like, okay, we have this new way of thinking, but how does it fit into the bigger picture of what philosophy is all about?
Exactly. They were questioning the nature of philosophy, its role, and how it differed from these other traditions. And the second distinctive trait is this connection to promoting change, both within universities and in broader social and political contexts.
Ah, so it wasn't just seen as an abstract intellectual pursuit, but as something with real-world implications.
Right. In many cases, analytic philosophy was seen as a tool for intellectual and social progress. So, not just thinking about ideas, but also thinking about how those ideas can be used to make a difference.
That's really cool. It adds this whole other layer of purpose to their philosophical work.
It does, and it directly connects to this idea of acting as philosophers in a very engaged and impactful way. Okay, ready to dive into the historical details?
Lead the way.
The story begins around the mid-20th century, but it's not a uniform development across the entire region. Different countries have their own unique narratives.
From what I've gathered, Argentina seems to be one of the early hotspots, starting in the mid-1940s.
It was, and it's interesting how it all began. We see these small, informal discussion groups popping up, intellectuals getting together to explore these new ideas. So it starts outside of the formal academic structures, almost like a grassroots movement.
So organic, driven by genuine curiosity.
Exactly. And then, in the mid-1950s, analytic philosophy starts to make its way into universities through a couple of interesting avenues.
Tell me more about those avenues.
Well, on the one hand, you have mathematicians and physicists who are interested in the philosophical foundations of science.
So people who are already dealing with logic and rigorous thinking, and they're naturally drawn to these new philosophical tools.
Right, they're bringing with them ideas from logical positivism, a movement that emphasizes empirical evidence and logical analysis as the basis of knowledge.
A very science-minded approach.
And then on the other hand, you have lawyers who are interested in exploring the formal structures of legal reasoning and the nuances of language in legal texts.
That's a fascinating contrast. So you have this very precise, formalistic approach coming from the sciences, and then this focus on everyday language coming from the legal world.
It's a really interesting mix, and a key figure in those early days is Mario Bunge.
I've heard that name. He seems to have been a driving force behind the early development of analytic philosophy in Argentina.
Absolutely. In 1944, he founded Minerva, which was likely the first journal in Latin America dedicated solely to philosophy.
So creating a platform for these new ideas to circulate and be debated.
Right. He also started the Círculo Filosófico de Buenos Aires, a crucial hub for philosophical discussion. And his book Causality, published in 1959, is considered one of the first major works in the analytic tradition by a Latin American philosopher.
It's amazing how a single individual can have such a huge impact. So he's not just writing philosophy, he's actively building a community, creating spaces for dialogue, and establishing platforms for new voices. That's a powerful lesson in how philosophical traditions take root.
Couldn't agree more. And then as we move into the mid-1950s, we see figures like Carlos Cosio in the field of law working on modal logic, Bunge himself continuing to contribute to philosophy of science, and Gregorio Klimovsky making significant contributions to logic and the foundations of mathematics.
It's interesting how these different areas of expertise are coming together to shape this emerging philosophical landscape.
It is. And while Klimovsky might not have published as extensively as some of his contemporaries, he was a remarkably influential teacher, mentoring a whole generation of Argentinian analytic philosophers.
So his impact wasn't just through his own writing, but through shaping the minds of those who would go on to become leading figures in the field. That's incredible. It shows the ripple effect of mentorship and intellectual lineage.
Exactly. And among those he mentored, we see names like Thomas Morrow Simpson, who really established the field of philosophy of language in Argentina.
Simpson's book, Formas Lógicas, Realidad y Significado, is mentioned as being especially influential, even reaching Mexico. So his ideas were clearly traveling beyond Argentina's borders.
They were. And then you have his students, like Raul Orián, known for his work on paradoxes and set theory, and Alberto Moretti, who delved deep into the work of Frege, Davidson, and Tarski, really emphasizing the importance of logic for understanding language, thought, and reality.
Logic is the foundation of it all.
And let's not forget Felix Schuster, another student of Klimovsky's, who made important contributions to social philosophy with his work on explanation and prediction in the social sciences.
It seems like Klimovsky's influence was pretty widespread. It's like he planted the seed that grew into this whole flourishing tree of ideas.
A great analogy. And then alongside this, you have a strong thread developing in legal philosophy with figures like Carlos Cosio and Ambrosio Gioja paving the way for Gennaro Cario and Eduardo Rebosi, who focused on ordinary language philosophy.
Ordinary language philosophy. So the idea that by carefully examining how we use language in everyday life, we can gain insights into philosophical problems.
Exactly. And then there's the groundbreaking work of Carlos Ochoron and Eugenio Bulligan, who really delved into deontic logic and the analysis of normative systems.
Deontic logic being the logic of norms and obligations,
Yeah.
right? And their work on legal systems as essentially structured by logical rules was pretty revolutionary, wasn't it?
It was. And Ochoron's later work on belief change, known as AGM theory, had a huge impact internationally. He applied those same logical tools to understand how we revise our beliefs in light of new information, which is a core question in epistemology.
Applying that logical rigor to something as seemingly subjective as belief revision is fascinating.
It is. And speaking of impact, we can't forget Carlos Nino, who played a vital role in ethics, philosophy of law, and constitutional theory, especially during Argentina's transition back to democracy in the 1980s.
A perfect example of how analytic philosophy wasn't just happening in an ivory tower, but was actively engaging with real-world political and social issues.
Exactly. Nino's work grappled with the legacy of human rights abuses and provided a philosophical foundation for legal reforms. A powerful example of acting as philosophers to create a more just and equitable society.
And then, unfortunately, the turbulent political period of the late 1960s and early 70s in Argentina had a significant impact on the philosophical community. We see many philosophers resigning or leaving the country due to political pressures. But out of this challenging period, something really important emerged. SEDEF.
SADEF, the Sociedad Argentina de Análisis Filosófico, became a crucial lifeline for the analytic community. This was a time of repression and uncertainty, and SADEF provided a space for intellectual exchange, training new generations of philosophers, and maintaining those vital international connections.
So even in the face of adversity, the philosophical spirit persisted, adapting and finding new ways to thrive.
And it highlights how important those intellectual communities can be, especially during difficult times. They provide support, inspiration, and a sense of shared purpose.
And SADEF also launched Analysis Filosófico, which was the first Argentinian journal dedicated to analytic philosophy. Another example of how this act of community building, of creating platforms for dialogue and dissemination, is so crucial to the development of a philosophical tradition.
Absolutely. Now let's shift our focus to Mexico, where the story has a slightly different flavor. The roots of analytic philosophy there are intertwined with earlier influences from phenomenology, existentialism, and even Marxism.
Ah, so a different mix of intellectual ingredients in the Mexican context.
Right. And a lot of this influence came through Spanish intellectuals who had emigrated to Mexico and through early Mexican philosophers at UNAM, the National Autonomous University of Mexico. UNAM and its Instituto de Investigaciones Filosóficas, IOAFS, the Institute of Philosophical Research, were really central to the development of analytic philosophy in Mexico.
So we see those institutional structures playing a key role.
They did. And initially, analytic philosophy was seen as a critical tool, a way to move beyond certain European philosophical traditions and establish a more rigorous, science-oriented approach to philosophical questions.
So using analytic philosophy as a way to critically engage with existing ideas, to challenge assumptions, and to push for a more rigorous approach.
Exactly. We see figures like Antonio Caso comparing logical positivism with phenomenology, and Nicholas Molina offering a defense of logical positivism in those early days. Then there's the influential philosopher José Gauss, whose work focused primarily on the history of philosophy.
But then, one of Gauss's students, Alejandro Rossi, took a different path. He saw analytic philosophy as a way to achieve greater rigor, especially after participating in a commemoration of the philosopher Husserl. It seems like his time at Oxford was a turning point.
It was. Rossi's experience at Oxford exposed him to the cutting edge of analytic philosophy of language, and he brought those ideas back to Mexico. He did some really important work on definite descriptions, proper names, and other topics in philosophy of language, even anticipating some of the later arguments of Saul Kripke.
So another example of how those intellectual exchanges across borders can have a significant impact on the development of a philosophical tradition.
Definitely. And Rossi's book, Lenguaje y Significado, collected those important early contributions and helped to introduce these ideas to a wider audience in Mexico.
Okay, now let's talk about IIS, the Institute of Philosophical Research. Its establishment and growth seems to be a pivotal moment in the story of analytic philosophy in Mexico. It started as the Centro de Estudios Filosóficos, founded by Eduardo García Menes, and while it wasn't explicitly analytic in its early days, it laid the groundwork for what would become a major center for analytic philosophy.
It did. They built up a strong library, created research positions, and established publishing avenues. And then, when Fernando Samaran became chair, he really steered the institute towards analytic philosophy.
Samaron sounds like a visionary leader.
He was. His vision was to transform IFs into a truly international center of excellence in analytic philosophy. He sent students to train abroad at leading universities, recruited prominent analytic philosophers like Bunjane Moulins, organized international conferences, launched an ambitious program to translate key analytic texts into Spanish, and co-founded the influential journal Critica with Rossi and Villoro.
Wow, quite a legacy. He was really building a robust and vibrant intellectual community, and it seems like his efforts paid off. The 1970s and 80s saw a surge in Mexican analytic philosophy with figures like Luis Villoro, who transitioned from phenomenology, and others like Mark Platz, who came to Mexico after training abroad.
Villoro's book, Creer Saber Conocer, is a great example of someone using the tools of analytic philosophy to grapple with fundamental questions about belief and knowledge, while also drawing on his broader philosophical interests. And Platt's work in philosophy of language, his engagement with social and political issues, really shows the wide range of topics that analytic philosophy could address.
It wasn't just confined to narrow technical questions, but could tackle issues of real-world significance.
Absolutely. Then, under the leadership of Leon Olivet, Aleph entered an expansion phase, with new research areas being explored. And while not all the new hires were strictly analytic philosophers, there's a clear openness to diverse approaches while maintaining that core commitment to rigor and clarity.
So growth and diversification while staying true to those foundational principles.
And that brings us to Brazil, where the story of analytic philosophy is shaped by a fascinating interplay of logic and broader philosophical trends. On the one hand, you have this strong tradition in logic, which ultimately leads to the development of the influential Brazilian school of paraconsistent logic. And on the other hand, you have a more general philosophical tradition that initially leaned towards continental philosophy, but increasingly engaged with analytic themes.
So two parallel threads eventually intertwining to create something new and exciting.
Exactly. On the logic side, we see early figures like Amoroso Costa and Vicente Ferreira da Silva laying the groundwork. And the impact of W.V.O. Quine's lectures at the University of São Paulo, USP, in the 1940s shouldn't be underestimated.
Quine being a giant of American analytic philosophy, his influence must have been significant.
It was. But the real surge in mathematical logic in Brazil happens in the late 1950s and onwards. We see the rise of research groups, and figures like Edson Ferra, Leonidas Hagenberg, and especially Newton da Costa really take center stage.
Da Costa's work on paraconsistent logic seems to have been particularly influential.
It was groundbreaking. Paraconsistent logics are systems designed to handle contradictions in a way that classical logic can't. It opened up a whole new way of thinking about logic and reasoning, and da Costa's Curitiba group put Brazil on the map as a major center for the study of non-classical logics. And his first doctoral student, Ida Ignes Arruda, also played a key role in building this community. Eventually, this led to the formation of the Sociedade Brasileira de Lógica, SBL, the Brazilian Logic Society.
So from individual brilliance to the creation of lasting institutions that would continue to foster and nurture this tradition.
Now, on the philosophy thread, things start a bit differently. At USP, the early influence was heavily French, with a strong structuralist orientation. The work of Gilles Gaston Granger is mentioned as particularly impactful.
A different philosophical flavor than what we've seen in Argentina and Mexico so far.
Right. But then, figures like José Gennady, who initially had an interest in logic, start to engage with the work of Marx and Wittgenstein. He even translated Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. And then there's Oswaldo Porchat, whose intellectual journey is really interesting. He initially struggled with this conflict of philosophies, trying to reconcile these different approaches, before eventually turning to mathematical logic.
So a kind of intellectual wrestling match before
Yeah.
finding a path forward.
Exactly. And Porchat was instrumental in creating CLE, the Centro de Lógica, Epistemologia e Historia da Ciencia, at the University of Campinas, Unicamp. CLE became another major hub for analytic philosophy in Brazil, publishing journals like Manuscrito, Cadernos de Historia e Filosofia da Ciencia, and the Journal of Non-Classical Logics.
Another example of those institutional structures being so crucial for the development of a philosophical tradition.
Absolutely. And we also see early pockets of analytic interest in Rio de Janeiro with figures like Urialo Canabrava, Paulo Alcoforado, who translated Frege and worked on ordinary language philosophy, Mario Guerrero, known for his work on common sense and skepticism, and Guido Antonio de Almeida, who focused on speech acts and Wittgenstein.
So it's spreading. This analytic approach is finding fertile ground in different parts of Brazil.
And then a significant turning point comes in the 1970s with the expansion of graduate programs and the increased availability of scholarships. This leads to a huge growth in the number of philosophers trained in the analytic tradition.
A real boom period.
It was. And with this growth comes some fragmentation, but also efforts at integration. We see the emergence of AMPOF, the Associação Nacional de Pós-Graduação em Filosofia, the National Association of Graduate Programs in Philosophy, and eventually the creation of SBFA, the Sociedade Brasileira de Filosofia Analítica, the Brazilian Society for Analytic Philosophy.
Bringing the community together on a national level.
Right. Now let's shift gears and talk about Colombia, where the development of analytic philosophy takes a slightly different path. For a significant period, there's a slower uptake of analytic philosophy, and analytic authors are primarily seen as subjects of study or resources for interpreting classical philosophers.
So not so much doing analytical philosophy, but more thinking about it from a distance.
Exactly. And there's even some resistance among philosophers who use analytic methods to actually identify themselves as analytic philosophers.
Hesitation to embrace the label, even if the methods are there. Interesting.
It is, but we do see early figures like Carlos B. Gutierrez offering critiques of Wittgenstein and Ruben Sierra introducing and commenting on various analytic authors at UNL, the National University of Colombia in Bogota.
Laying the groundwork, even if it's not a full-fledged embrace.
Right. But then things start to change in the 1980s. We see the emergence of philosophers like Magdalena Holguin, who worked on Wittgenstein and skepticism. And her book, Wittgenstein y el Escepticismo, is mentioned as being particularly influential. Adolfo Leon Gomez, who focused on speech acts, argumentation, and practical reason. And Juan Jose Botero, who worked in philosophy of mind.
So the 80s seem like a turning point in Colombia, with these figures really bringing analytic philosophy into the spotlight.
It was a significant shift. And then in the 1990s, we see a further consolidation of analytic philosophy at UNL, with figures like Jaime Ramos, who worked on philosophy of mind and Wittgenstein, Raul Melendez, focusing on Wittgenstein, truth, and philosophy of mathematics, Alejandro Rosas, who offered analytic reconstructions of Kant, and Luis Eduardo Hoyos, known for his work on the skeptical reception of Kant.
It's spreading. This analytic approach is taking hold in different areas of philosophy.
And then, in the early 2000s, there's another wave of influential figures arriving at UNL. Ignacio Avila, working on objectivity, subjectivity, and spatiality. William Duica, who specializes in epistemology and the philosophy of Davidson. And Adrian Tussens, known for his work on non-conceptual content.
So each generation building on the work of those who came before, expanding the scope and reach of analytic philosophy in Colombia.
Exactly. And more recently, Universidad de los Andes has emerged as a significant center for analytic philosophy, with philosophers like Andres Paez working on logic, legal epistemology, and philosophy of AI, and Santiago Amaya focusing on philosophy of action and moral psychology. They even host the Philogica conferences, further fostering this intellectual community.
So multiple centers of analytic philosophy thriving in Colombia.
They are, and while there might not be a dedicated journal solely for analytic philosophy in Colombia, we see analytic works regularly appearing in established philosophy journals, indicating that this approach has become a well-integrated part of the broader philosophical landscape.
A sign of its acceptance and growing influence.
Now, before we move on to discuss some of the original contributions that have emerged from Latin American analytic philosophy, let's briefly touch on a few other countries in the region.
Okay, give me the highlights.
In Peru, we see early figures like Francisco Miro Quesada, known for his work on logic and the nature of understanding, and Augusto Salazar Bondi, who translated Moore and Wittgenstein and explored the philosophy of language and liberation philosophy. Later on, nascent analytic communities emerge at the Pontifical Catholic University of Peru and the National University of San Marcos. In Chile, the initial focus was on mathematical logic, with figures like Juan Rubano and Rolando Toki. Roberto Torretti, a prominent philosopher of science known for his work on Kant, also had an early interest in analytic philosophy, although he later went into exile, as did Alfonso Gomez Lobo, who produced translations of Frege. Ernst Tugendhat's visiting professorship in Chile also had a significant impact. And more recently, in the 21st century, we see a new generation of Chilean analytic philosophers emerging, many of whom have trained abroad. In Puerto Rico, philosophy as an academic discipline was heavily influenced by Ludwig Schadogic and Roberto Torretti, who also had a hand in establishing Diálogos, a prominent philosophy journal. Uruguay has a tradition going back to Carlos Vaz Ferreira and early engagements with the work of Frege and Austin. And Venezuela saw early introductions of analytic ideas by figures like Juan David Garcia Baca and Juan Nuño. What's interesting, though, is that in some other Latin American countries, there's a less visible presence of analytic philosophy, which the source suggests might be due to a complex interplay of political, historical, and economic factors.
That makes sense. The development of ideas doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's always shaped by the specific context.
Absolutely. Okay, now let's shift gears and talk about some of the original contributions that have emerged from Latin American analytic philosophy. And given our focus on acting as philosophers, I think the reflections on the nature of philosophy itself, metaphilosophy, are especially relevant.
Meta-philosophy, that philosophy about philosophy. It's like taking a step back and examining the very tools and practices we use as philosophers.
Exactly. And because analytic philosophy arrived in a context where other philosophical traditions were already well established in Latin America, there was this natural impulse to reflect on what this new approach meant, how it fit in, and how it differed from these existing traditions.
That kind of self-awareness, a critical examination of the very enterprise of philosophy.
Precisely. And one of the key themes that emerges is this idea of using analytic philosophy as a tool for professionalizing the field of philosophy in Latin American universities.
So not just doing philosophy, but thinking about how to do it in a more rigorous, systematic, and, well, professional way.
Right. And this involved emphasizing things like clear argumentation, conceptual precision, and logical rigor as hallmarks of a more professional philosophical practice.
So raising the bar, setting higher standards.
And we see this reflected in the efforts of figures like Salmerón in Mexico, who really championed this vision of a more professionalized philosophy.
But then, there are also voices that challenge this very notion of professionalization. Eduardo Rabossi, for instance, argues that philosophy, as we understand it today, is actually a historically specific phenomenon that arose from a particular set of circumstances in 19th century Germany.
Rabussi's point is that there's no fixed, timeless essence of what constitutes philosophy. It's a practice that evolves and changes over time, shaped by historical forces and intellectual trends. So he's questioning this idea that there's one right way to do philosophy, one set of standards that applies universally.
A healthy dose of skepticism towards any claims of absolute authority or a single correct method.
And then more recently, we see an even more critical perspective on professionalization emerging, with figures like Guillermo Hurtado arguing that the push for professionalization has actually led to a neglect of broader human questions and the specific intellectual and social context of Latin America. He's worried that in trying to be more professional, philosophy has become too narrow, too detached from the real world.
Losing sight of the bigger picture.
And on the other side of the debate, you have figures like Manuel Garcia Carpintero, who defend professionalization, pointing to the genuine progress that has been made within analytic philosophy.
So a real tension between these different views of what philosophy should be and how it should be practiced.
And Pablo Quintanilla adds another layer to the discussion, suggesting that many of these tensions aren't unique to analytic philosophy, but are actually tied to larger global trends in research and academic policy.
So a reflection not just on philosophy, but on the very structures and institutions within which philosophical inquiry takes place.
Exactly. It's a really rich and thought-provoking debate, and it's a great example of how Latin American philosophers are engaging in metaphilosophy in a really serious and meaningful way. They're not just accepting the status quo, but they're actively questioning and critically examining the very nature and practice of their own discipline.
And that brings us to another really fascinating area of metaphilosophical reflection, the role of language in philosophy.
Ah, yes, the language question, a particularly thorny issue for philosophers working in non-English speaking regions.
Especially with the increasing dominance of English in contemporary analytic philosophy, it raises some tough questions. Should philosophers in Latin America prioritize publishing and working in English over Spanish or Portuguese? What are the implications of this linguistic shift?
There's no easy answer. On the one hand, you have a pragmatic perspective, championed by figures like Rodriguez, Pereira, and Rufino, who argue that English has become the new lingua franca of philosophy for professional reasons. It allows for wider dissemination of ideas, greater engagement with the international philosophical community, and increased opportunities for collaboration.
So the practical argument for adopting the dominant language.
Right. But there are also strong counter-arguments to this view. Scholars like Perez and Hurtado emphasize the political, cultural, linguistic, and even experiential dimensions of language. They argue that the choice of language isn't just a matter of convenience, but that it can have profound implications for the way we think and the kinds of questions we ask. They're worried that by overwhelmingly adopting English, we risk marginalizing perspectives and insights that are rooted in other linguistic traditions.
So a concern about the potential for intellectual homogenization, of losing the richness and diversity of thought that comes from engaging with different languages and cultures.
Exactly. And there's also the worry that language itself shapes thought. The words we use, the grammatical structures we employ, all of these things can influence the way we conceptualize the world and the kinds of philosophical problems we deem important. So the choice of language isn't just a neutral tool, it's something that can have a real impact on the content and direction of philosophical inquiry.
A powerful reminder that language isn't just a vehicle for thought, but can actually shape and constrain the very thoughts we're able to think.
And it's important to remember that this debate isn't just theoretical. It has real-world implications for philosophers, especially those working in regions where English isn't the dominant language. It affects their career trajectories, their access to publishing opportunities, and their ability to engage in international philosophical dialogue. So it's a complex issue with no easy answers, but it's a vital conversation to be having.
Now, while we focus primarily on this metaphilosophical dimension of acting as philosophers in Latin America, it's crucial to remember that Latin American analytic philosophers have also made significant original contributions in other core areas of philosophy.
Absolutely. We see important work being done in philosophy of language and mind, as well as in applied areas like ethics, bioethics, and philosophy of law.
So, not just reflecting on the nature of philosophy, but actually doing philosophy, grappling with those fundamental questions, and applying philosophical insights to real-world issues.
Right. And these contributions aren't just repetitions of debates happening elsewhere. They often bring fresh perspectives and insights shaped by the unique intellectual histories and social contexts of the region. For instance, the source highlights Gomez Corrente's work on reference, fixing a fundamental question in philosophy of language about how our words actually manage to pick out objects and concepts in the world, and Luna's influential work on the concept of vulnerability in bioethics, which has had a significant impact on ethical discussions in the region and beyond.
So, real intellectual innovation happening, driven by a combination of rigorous philosophical thinking and a deep engagement with the specific challenges and concerns of their context.
Exactly. It's a testament to the intellectual vitality and originality of Latin American analytic philosophy. And it's a reminder that philosophy isn't just an abstract universal pursuit, but that it's always grounded in particular historical and cultural contexts, which shape the questions we ask and the answers we seek.
So to bring it all together, this deep dive into the history of analytic philosophy in Latin America has been a fascinating journey. We've seen how this tradition took root in a new context, how it was adapted and transformed, and how it ultimately led to a flourishing of philosophical activity and original thought.
It's a story of intellectual adaptation, critical engagement, and a deep commitment to the philosophical enterprise. And it highlights the many different ways in which one can act as a philosopher, from building institutions and fostering intellectual communities to challenging established norms and pushing the boundaries of philosophical inquiry.
And it all started with a simple question. What does it mean to do philosophy? Well, I think we've got our answer. It's a dynamic and multifaceted endeavor, shaped by context, driven by passion, and constantly evolving. And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listeners. Considering the ongoing debate about the role of language in philosophy, what might be gained or lost if philosophical discourse were to become dominated by a single language? How might the specific histories, cultures, and languages of different regions continue to shape and enrich philosophical inquiry in an increasingly interconnected world? It's a question worth pondering as we continue to explore the diverse and ever-changing landscape of philosophical thought. And that's a wrap for this deep dive. We encourage you to check out the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry for yourself and delve deeper into the work of some of the thinkers we've discussed today. Until next time, keep those aha moments coming. See you then. Bye for now.